Thank you for tuning in to Sparks and Honey's Daily Culture Briefing. My name is Ben Grinspan, and today we're going to be doing, we'll be looking at culture in the horizontal and across industries, but we're also going to be looking at it very deeply in the vertical, because today is a special briefing where we are going to spend our whole hour talking about quantum computing. We are all going to leave here, if not seeming a lot smarter, then at least looking a lot smarter. Joining us today to lead this discussion is Michael Brett. Michael is a member of the Sparks and Honey Advisory Board and an expert in complex systems with extensive experience in the development and adoption of early-stage technologies. He has delivered breakthrough solutions in the aerospace, defense, and data analytics industries. Before we start getting into the real meat of this conversation today about quantum computing, we wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about quantum computing's cultural relevance and what it means today in our culture, in our innovation systems. And obviously, we wanted to start with a meme, and I'm going to tell you ahead of time, we are at a nascent stage for quantum computing memes. But I thought this one, which is related to quantum computing, helped. I know it's about quantum entanglements, but as we know, one does not simply walk into Mordor. So one does not simply walk into quantum computing as well. We're hoping to take this nice and easy and maybe fly out on the back of an eagle as well. But before we jump in, we want to talk about how our system Q thinks about quantum computing. So Q is our cultural intelligence system. It brings in thousands of signals in language globally and uses them, tags them to our elements of culture, and uses them to track and quantify culture. Now, we brought in about 4,000 different signals today when we were talking about quantum computing, which strongly suggests that this is an emerging conversation that we're having culturally. But obviously, our panel of guests here, we talk about this stuff occasionally. And I'm curious, before we jump into our elements of culture map, we thought we'd try a little experiment and see if anybody here thought that there were any particular elements of cultures or trends that we're going to see when we look at our zeitgeist map when I turn the page. Anything that you guys might expect, knowing what you do about quantum computing?
I think robots everywhere, and data divinity, and these are the two on the top of my head that should be there.
Yeah. Sounds about right. Any others? Anna, you want to jump in?
Probably superhuman, kind of thinking beyond the realms of what we can conceive of today.
Yes, beyond the realms of man. So we are right. Congratulations, guys. So we can see robots everywhere. Nano is here. Data divinity. I love that superhuman is here because I think that is fundamentally one of the things that Michael is going to be addressing. How can quantum computing make us data superheroes, I suppose? And I wanted to show our quadrant map just before we jumped into our signals, because there's something interesting going on here. Now, for those of you who are new to Q, this is our quadrant map. It lets us make predictions about where culture is going based on that quantitative insights that we were talking about. And you can see that we've highlighted the top 5 ones here. And I just want to show our predictions for the next 12 to 24 months, what our AI, what our computer learning is telling us here. And when we jump forward 1 year, and then jump forward 2 years, we can see that SMART, our element of culture around technology adapting to meet our needs, has some really, really strong cultural relevance. And it's going to really power, I think, where quantum computing is going. So I'd like you to keep that in mind as we look at sort of the cultural presence of quantum computing today before we get into the real nuts and bolts and subatomic particles of it all. So let's start with an article here from the New York Times, Quantum Computing Explained in Mere Minutes. This past October, in a Google research lab in Santa Barbara, California, a milestone was achieved that scientists have been working towards since the 1980s, a breakthrough called quantum supremacy that could allow new kinds of computers to do calculations at speeds that are basically inconceivable today. The tool Google used to perform the calculations in this near mythical device is that quantum computer that we were talking about. And basically, it relies on making changes at the subatomic level to do these sort of mind-bending speeds. Now, there are probably lots of people in this room who get this, but just for the uninitiated, I want to read how the New York Times describes quantum computing to you. So traditional computers perform calculations by processing bits of information, with each bit holding a value of 1 or 0. A collection of 8 bits, known as a byte, can store a single character, like, say, the letter A or the letter Q. A quantum computing, on the other hand, processes bits by scientists that can exist both as a 1 and a 0 simultaneously. So while traditional bits hold only 2 values, you would pair these qubits, as they're called, can hold 4 values at once. So anyway, this long sought-through breakthrough could have implications for national security and cryptology. I swear we will get into that. And even pave the way for creation of potentially new medicines. Now, in recent years, big tech has taken note of this. Microsoft, Intel, IBM, and Alibaba are all trying to be dominant in this space. Venture capitalists have put $450 million, probably closer to $500 million at this point into the industry. So I guess my question for you guys, and Michael, feel free to weigh in, but anybody in the panel can jump in on this. What do we think the public knows about quantum computing today? And is this the kind of thing that Google can trumpet and make their brand seem great to everybody, or is this maybe a scientific community play for them?
One thing that stands out to me is, like, anytime new technology comes out that's as transformative or going to be as transformative as quantum computing, we start to reevaluate culture and the way that we talk about ourselves and reflect our own human identities through these technologies. What's really interesting about quantum computing that I hope people start to internalize and pick up on is that idea that you're holding 2 states of existence at once. Right now, our model for technology is binary. It's very off or on. And humanity doesn't necessarily reflect that binary. We're often in a state of tension where 2 things coexist in our mind at the same time. So partly to answer your question, I hope that as people internalize what quantum computing means, it opens up a new sense of self-reference as to you can be these complex things, and we see it in the machinery that now underpins our world.
I love that. Alice?
One implication for the healthcare industry is like it's able to identify patterns through like a massive amount of healthcare data, through like the sensory systems, from like the, really putting like the patients in the center of the care. And because of that, like it's able to enable we moving from like prevention health to predictive health. So it's able to identify like our behavioral change or our lifestyle having an imprint on our DNA in order to like make changes to our life. And another thing is like the potential barrier is the inconsistent data set. For example, if you look visit like 3 different types of like doctors, and then they may have like different data sets, like that's potential barriers. But things like Google is moving into healthcare, like bought the Fitbit, and Amazon just launched the Amazon like pharmacy. So there's tech giants that has the potential like to build this ecosystem to close the loop of that.
Yeah.
Just to highlight that benchmarking test that was reported on by the New York Times there, this is a really significant milestone in the development of quantum computing. It's the first time that all of the systems have come together at once. So we've had isolated pieces, but building a whole system that works and outperforms a classical benchmark on a classical computer. And the cultural touch point that I like to use for this is it's kind of like that moment when Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess in the mid-90s. It's that transition between what one existing system was able to do, a human in this case, and the computer being able to beat that, and that tipping point over.
Yeah. So one major hurdle facing any new potentially breakthrough technology is obviously too much hype. And while quantum computing may be a little niche today, there are those who are promising basically to revolutionize the whole world using it. Obviously, this raises the blood pressure in some people. So haunted by fears that disappointment with the technology or lack of progress or slow progress could lead to cynicism and even funding cuts, a small band of researchers is now working to rebrand those expectations with a meme lord and shitposting account called @QuantumBullshit. Quote, "We had no idea that it would be so popular, especially not among so many senior figures in the field. Our next goal is to convince Peter Shore, who is a major figure in the field, to follow us," said the students who run the account anonymously. And while many of the memes they put out there relate to PhD life problems or show love for papers that they think are particularly interesting, they have definitely gone after some major figures in the quantum computing field, from leaders at Google to major technology figures at universities like Caltech and MIT. They've also taken to beating up venture capital as well, and their desire to perhaps artificially overheat the market. Michael and I were talking. He has had some encounters with these people, and I guess I'm curious. Should we be praising these meme lords? You guys think for trying to pop this balloon a little bit, or are they dampening something that we really ought to be pretty excited about?
Well, I guess what's interesting is that like popular culture has a way to sort of frame these sort of more complex things, right? When the millennial comes over, there's like all this like product that is supposed to sort of like fix the bug, including like certain pesticides, right? That they sell to people who don't really understand what it is. Like there's like the Bitcoin, right? That's sort of a couple of years ago. There's like certain like product and hype on anything around Bitcoin or like is a go, and I think what's interesting is that when the public has like this sort of like jokingly like end goal to sort of understand like mimification of this, to understand this in like a sort of somewhat of a distorted lens, like we are missing the real picture. Like when the computing power is going to be by magnitude like much cheaper than what it is now, like with like the downward cost of the sensor. Like, are we going to get like data collection and privacy, like magnitudes of like what we have today, and getting like much more processing power behind that? Yeah. So they are going to build a much higher res image that sort of creep into our privacy like never before. So I think these are more real like watch out versus like this sort of the funny memeable aspect.
Internecine
Well, I also
conflict.
feel that by being able to kind of poke fun at yourself and create this space, you are like kind of taking power away from the critics that could do that for you. So you like really can't troll a troll. So it's a good play.
Yeah. So naturally, any revolution in computing technology is going to come with some very big market impacts. And this is actually a piece that came out of Wharton trying to get, so I suppose, the business community to understand what the real market value of quantum computing is going to be. So they start by talking about insurance. An insurer could fully leverage quantum computing, could be able to run forecasts and predictions, and generate what they're calling perhaps a nearly perfectly balanced risk portfolio in a way that insurers couldn't do today. Similarly, as Alice pointed out, quantum computing could impact things in perhaps science and drug development. That cycle can take up to 10 years now. It can cost $2.5 billion to develop a new drug. The potential of quantum computing is to massively speed that up by allowing us to process many more data sets and to run many more regressions than we could in a traditional model. I suppose the question then about this is that a lot of the applications that this article points out, and the ones we've discussed today, are really big, broad, business-focused applications. I'm curious if you guys see if you see potential for consumers in this, how we talk to consumers about this. What is the value for the end user here of that technology? Michael, I might ask you to weigh in.
Yeah, quantum computing is high-performance computing. It's infrastructure computing, so it's a business-to-business kind of play. The major beneficiaries of quantum computing will be large enterprises, governments, that type of thing, that already spend a lot of money on compute. So if you personally are spending a couple of tens of millions of dollars a year on your own personal compute infrastructure, you might get some benefit from quantum computing, but it's unlikely. What you will see as a consumer is your package is delivered slightly earlier, your 401k performing better than it did before, your insurance slightly cheaper or optimized to you, because these enterprises are using this new power of compute to optimize their products to what they offer to you.
Thinking about this from the lens of new semantics, one of the trends we track here, it'll be interesting to see how the word quantum is used outside of the realm of technology as a descriptor. We're kind of in this like immediate quick effect reactive phase of communicating. So I think quantum is probably something that we're going to splash onto things that have probably nothing to do with quantum computing.
Sure.
Quick thought on the luxury industry. I always thought that luxury industry is untouched by whatever is happening in technology, but over the last year at Sparks and Honey, we have had many discussions in our briefings about how retail is changing. And so I think that even though these companies might think that quantum computing will not do any good to them, but as Michael pointed out, that 401k and all these little things will affect the consumer. So I also think that even though luxury industry thinks that they will be untouched by quantum computing, but that will not be the case.
Yeah, it's a really interesting differentiator, especially in, say, the insurance or the financial services space, where those differentiators, I think, are hard to come across. I'm going to block the next two signals together because we have talked about the potential for quantum computing, but it's also time to talk a little bit about perhaps some of the setbacks, the challenges with it. It's not just meme lords and big brands we're talking about quantum computing. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is also interested in it as well. well. Yes, North Korea is promoting the adoption of quantum computing for the nation's economic development, according to the South Korean news service. The North Korean NK Economy, which is, I suppose, one of those, reported a couple months ago, that quantum computers are being highlighted in the Korean Worker Party newspaper. I suppose what they're saying here, the news coming out of North Korea, is that they too want to participate in this change in processing speed, that opportunities are exploding, and that they want to participate in this major global development in technology. Obviously, a country that has extremely irregular access to electricity might face some problems in doing that, but it seems to me that at least somebody in their PR department over there in North Korea is paying attention to this stuff and understands perhaps that quantum computing is going to be a game-changing technology. Now, there are concerns here. South Korea obviously has lots of tensions with North Korea, and there are some real security issues with quantum computing as well. I'll jump into this one quickly. Today, the world relies heavily on intractable encryption technology to protect everything from our digital signatures to our private emails to our social security numbers. But technologists and researchers alike argue that the security sector should pivot at least some of its focus to quantum computing, which could present a massive long-term security predicament. Essentially, if we're able to run an enormously larger number of simulations, we will be better at guessing people's passwords. So this has led a number of people in that industry to worry not only about the consumer effects of that, about people figuring out how to hack into people's accounts faster, but also things like cyber attacks could be potentially pushed forward using that quantum computing technology. As the National Institute of Standards and Technology states, if large-scale quantum computers are ever built, let's say when they're built, they will be able to break many of the public key crypto systems currently in use. This would seriously compromise the confidentiality and integrity of digital communications on the internet and elsewhere. So I'm curious, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the North Korea thing, but I'm also curious about the security implications here, whether or not we are opening up a Pandora's box, perhaps, by blindly running into the world of quantum computing.
I think it sets up a future where there is no longer privacy of our past, which we're sort of living in now, but it's not hard to imagine a major data hack of a Facebook or AT&T releasing all of our texts and private messages. So what does that mean for culture, and what does that mean for people who then have to live in a radically transparent, easily searchable world where all of our dark secrets are out there, indexed, perhaps facially recognized and connected to our profiles and existence online? What does that mean to day-to-day interactions and the way that we behave in the relationships we have and the ones we're going to have in the future?
And also this potential like moving national security into like cyber security, and then eventually, you know, like Russia is testing their own internet and Israel is testing their own internet. Potentially, we are the last generation for the internet freedom.
Right.
You know, then we all will have to build our own secure like ecosystem to protect ourselves from data.
Yeah. I guess another question is, like, is it going to sort of accelerate the haves and have-nots, right? As Michael, you mentioned, like, it's going to be like tens of millions of dollars to sort of engage with this new technology, like, especially in an environment like North Korea, where like the private sector is highly regulated, and like, you know, the private sector is not really doing a job in terms of like fighting with or monitoring the government. Like, you know, how is that going to sort of like consolidate or like, you know, accelerate, facilitate the control of the government, which is controlling a large asset in the technology sector, to its citizen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like this framing of the privacy of the past, because the risk here is not what a quantum computer can do today, but what a quantum computer is anticipated to do in the future. Mm-hmm. And let's say a quantum computer exists that's sufficiently capable to break these passwords in 20 years. Adversaries today are collecting data in anticipation of that and warehousing it. So it's encrypted, it's safe today, but they're essentially collecting mail to open in the future. And so if your past financial records, your medical records are something sensitive to you, that's something to be concerned about. And the reason why the US government is looking at different encryption standards is to incorporate those standards now in anticipation of this risk in the future.
So that's the cultural landscape of what we're talking about. I'd like to invite Michael up to take us through, again, a deeper dive into what we are discussing today with quantum computing.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to share with you some of what we do at Rigetti Computing, where we build quantum computers, and then also the landscape generally. Now, this is the title, Demystifying Quantum Computing Over Lunch. That's a challenge in itself, but I'll do the best that I can to bring you along on the journey. But we've heard a little bit already about why quantum computing matters and what some of the implications for this are. But there are opportunities and threats at the grand strategic level of nation states, but also large enterprises. Most of it falls into the theme around the race for global supremacy in AI. And we're seeing this manifest in the large technology providers, Google, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera, looking at how could quantum computing differentiate their offering in their cloud services environments. There's also that profound risk to everyday encryption that we just talked about. But the cover sheets that are on this slide here are all national strategies that have been produced in the last 12 months or so from the US, UK, Europe, Australia, France, and the Netherlands have all published national strategies for quantum technologies and are investing very heavily in this technology because it's seen as a national strategic priority, both to capture the opportunity side, but prevent that threat as well. So a great way to catch up on where quantum computing is headed and why this is so relevant is to download a copy of these reports and take a look at how it's being expressed at that national policy level. But on the opportunity side, the businesses that we work with are looking at what could we do with these quantum computers to help accelerate the work that we do. And so these are just some of the forecasts that have been published by Boston Consulting Group and from Gartner around things like the productivity gains that will come from increased compute from quantum computing, the value that could be delivered from improving the way that we do machine learning, how we could improve financial portfolio optimization. And they're all large numbers. This is a big opportunity for big industrial sectors to differentiate the style of compute that they're using and to create a differentiator in their own marketplace. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense about how we build these machines and what we're building at Rigetti. So Rigetti is a US-based startup company. We're based in California. The company is about 6 years old, about 150 people, and we have built a factory to build quantum computers. In Fremont, California, we've got our own fab. So we make computer chips in that fab on silicon wafers, very similar to the way that Intel and others have been making for the past 30 years or so. So we produce our own chips there, but those chips are very different. We use a particular type of technology called a superconducting qubit. Superconducting means that we cool it down to an operating temperature just above absolute zero. And then there is some very weird behavior that go on at that temperature, which allow us to make use of the strange world of quantum effects. We'll get into a little bit of that. But this is a picture of one of the chips that we produce at that fab. So out of that fab comes a computer chip. You can see a unique kind of design on that chip, and that layout, you can see individual qubits that are laid out there. So the processing information that we're working with at a superconducting level is laid out on that chip. And it's really quite neat to hold in your hand and to see with your own eyes a quantum device that's been manufactured in this way. So we take these chips, we drive them up the highway to Berkeley, California, where we build them up into systems. So those chips go inside one of these large canisters, the white canisters you see there, and that is a cryogenic refrigerator that will cool that chip down to its operating temperature. You'll see microwave control lines going in there. And so this is our quantum computing data center that Rigetti's been operating on the cloud for the last 2 years or so. So we serve up quantum computing in the cloud to our customers from this data center in California, and people can access it. So our customers, our partners, our academic users access these computers via the cloud and experiment with it and learn what quantum computing is, discover what applications are possible, benchmark what they're doing, and start to get a feel for where this technology is headed in the future. So inside one of these canisters, the chip itself is sort of plugged in underneath there on a sort of hockey puck looking thing. But we're really excited about being able to offer this to as many people as possible, because the very thing that quantum computers are good at solving is exactly the thing that classical computers are bad at solving. And so there's a real benefit to having quantum and classical computers working side by side together. So you use classical computers to do some work, and then quantum computers to solve really hard problems that we can't do on a classical machine. And those problems fall into areas that have huge economic benefit. So optimization problems, accelerating the way that we do machine learning, improving the way that we do Monte Carlo analysis, which is really relevant for finance. And a big one is in chemical simulation. So understanding the way that molecules interact with each other, get a better understanding of how drugs and pharmaceutical chemicals, agricultural chemicals are actually formed, that will reduce the amount of energy that goes into producing those systems. And so there's a huge potential benefit there. So one way to think about quantum computing is that this is just another tool in the toolkit. It's not going to replace classical computing. It's an extra tool in a mixed compute environment. So we already use a mixed compute environment today. You've got a laptop and a phone. When you're using the cloud, you're using CPUs and GPUs and tensor processing units and lots of different types of computers that solve specific problems in a really efficient way. And a quantum computer is just another tool in that toolkit. So in the cloud, we have quantum computers and classical computers working together in that mixed compute environment at the bottom of the diagram there. We've got a cloud platform to serve that up, then an application platform so that people can write applications and start to discover what's possible, and then individual units on top of that, which are making use of all those different computing technologies together. And so if you take nothing else away from today, it's to know that quantum computing is coming, but it's a new tool in that toolbox that allows us to do something quite different to what we could do with a classical computer, and combining them together is really important. What we've seen in the last 6 months or so is the major cloud service providers starting to incorporate this into their strategy. So AWS is now a distribution partner of Rigetti's. So those computers that I showed you before in those white canisters, they are being served up not only through our own cloud platform, but also through AWS as well. So if you're an AWS user, you're doing analytics with it, machine learning, your customer relationship management, you now have a new tool in that existing toolbox to get access to quantum computing through that environment. And so there's a real push now to make this as accessible a technology as we can, even though it's weird and exotic and got some strange physics going on. So I just wanted to give you one quick example of where we use machine learning and quantum computing to come together. And one of the business problems that we like to look at is particularly in image recognition, because it's a very human thing that we do. Humans are very good at image recognition and classification. If you show a 3-year-old child a cat, that child will remember what a cat is and be able to classify cats from dogs very, very easily for the rest of their life. Whereas a computer is not so good at learning that. And so there's a huge opportunity to get better at image recognition with computers. One of the data sets that we've been looking at has been satellite imagery. So as satellites fly across the Earth and they take lots of photos, how do we differentiate between forest and sea and desert, cities, and so on, and very quickly make that determination, particularly when it's low resolution or noisy data. Humans are good at kind of looking through the clouds and still being able to make out that feature, but computers aren't so great at it. So using both classical computers and quantum computers working together, we've built a thing called a convolutional neural network, and now a quantum convolutional neural network for the machine learning folks in the audience. But I just want to give you a sense of how well this is working over time. So just to show you what's going on here, this is the improvement of a machine learning algorithm over time as we train that algorithm up. So the more times we show it a picture of a cat, or the more times we show it a picture of a forest, how good does it get at recognizing that image in the future? So along the bottom is the number of times that we've shown it that image, and along the y-axis is how much that algorithm has improved in doing that recognition. And the quantum one is the yellow line there. The blue one is the best available classical alternative that we could do there. And it brings me back to that cultural touch point that I used before of Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue and the chess algorithm. You can see that they're really close right now. The best that we could do on our last machine was getting it around 55% accuracy with the quantum computer. Now we're up around the 70% accuracy with the quantum computer just in the last 6 months or so. And so we're right at that tipping point of a quantum machine being on par or close to the best available classical alternative. And this is really quite amazing because classical computers have had 60, 70 years of development. Trillions of dollars go into it to be able to get to this level of performance. Whereas quantum computing is a brand new technology. It's about 10 years old, even as an ecosystem, with a relatively modest amount of investment that's gone into it so far. And already we are competitive with the best available classical alternatives. So quantum computing is growing up quickly. It's still a developmental technology. But what it's able to do as a young technology is really impressive compared to the best available classical in the world. Just to give you another sense of how quickly this is moving and the players that are involved in this, the financial industry has been one of the leading industries at looking at quantum computing. They use lots of compute every day. They use lots of high-performance compute already. And so they are looking to make economic savings on reducing the amount of time and cost that goes into solving their problems, but also solving problems that they cannot solve today using a classical computer. And so laid out here is some of the applications around the circle there. So portfolio management, cybersecurity, asset pricing, risk analytics. These are things that are very difficult for banks today. And then the colored part is the institutions that are investing in this and the level of effort that's going in there. So you'll see names like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan that are investing in these applications themselves to do this work. This last slide, just to give you a sense of how rapidly this is being adopting, is the publicly published papers on quantum computing applications in the financial sector over the past 2 years. In 2018, there was one paper published by a bank about the applications that they're looking at in quantum computing. That's Standard Chartered down the bottom there. In 2019, there were 14 papers published by banks. So this is banks contributing to the science of quantum computing. But for every one of these papers that you see, there's intellectual property, there's know-how that's being produced inside these institutions as well. And so this is something that's being adopted very quickly. The reason that adoption is now being enabled is because quantum computers are available on the cloud and people are able to get their hands on it, start to play around and do experimental work, look at empirical results like what I showed you with the satellite imagery work, and really get a sense for how these new types of computers, a new tool in the toolkit, could impact some of the applications that they're looking at. So still an early technology. We'll see what happens as it affects consumer behavior and what some of the offerings are out into the world. But it's definitely one to watch as it comes to prominence over the next couple of years. So I'll finish up there and get into some Q&A.
Michael, I was curious about the complex systems challenges that we have to solve with climate change. It seems that people have a lot of challenges with, firstly, I guess, a satellite image collection to understand the damage of oceans and land, but secondly, the models. And that's been part of the critique against the climate science movement. Can you comment a little bit on that in terms of how you see quantum computing being able to bring us to closer and better and more reliable models?
Yeah, one of the things that we've noticed when our data scientists use quantum computers is the impact that reducing the training time of a machine learning algorithm means for their workflow day to day. And that's important because a data scientist will design an algorithm, they'll have some test data that they're working with, some training data, and they'll send it off to be processed and for the algorithm to learn. And that algorithm might take a few hours or a few days to be trained on computing systems. And meanwhile, the data scientist is sitting there doing email, whatever. They're waiting for those results to come back. And in that design loop, we need the human to be interacting with the algorithm and to be making judgments about quality and informing it and using their wisdom. So the faster we can train an algorithm, the more time a human has to interpret those results and make modifications. So if it takes 3 weeks for a climate model to run on the world's most powerful supercomputer today, that's 3 weeks of humans waiting for results. But if we can reduce that time even a little bit, the humans can be more involved in interpreting it. And I think that that's where we'll see a lot of gains by increasing the productivity of people that are involved in AI and machine learning and modeling, because they are getting results back faster and are able to interpret that work.
Go ahead.
Curious about any social sector applications, because it seems like there might be a little bit of a Los Alamos feel for the people who can be excited to work on it, but then the folks who are going to use it, you've already said, is mainly using it to mitigate the competition for, world power plays. And so I wonder, are you getting any questions or partnerships that head toward the other side of the human side?
Yeah, there's a lot of huge benefits that can be gained for all sorts of different things. So one in particular is looking at city planning and logistics and the efficiency of moving things around. So think of how challenging it would be to model the traffic flows of New York City on a given workday. That is something that's impossible today with a classical computer. But if we're able to use a quantum computer to model that better and understand what's possible, we can potentially reduce or improve the way that cities flow and the way that we interact. So one of the sectors that's picking this up a lot is the automotive sector. We're seeing a lot from the likes of VW, Daimler, Ford, and BMW have quantum computing programs that are investing in this. They're looking at things like battery technology, better autonomous work, better design, because these sorts of new tools in the toolkit can help them model flows better and get greater efficiencies out of things like logistics.
Sorry, Michael, could you just repeat the question for the camera after the person is answered?
You got it.
Thank you.
So you talked about reducing the time of training by using a quantum computer, right? So with now the services like AWS, like so many services in AWS, which can make that faster with cheaper amount to, like the quantum computers being so expensive, is it really worth reducing the training time using quantum computers?
We sure hope so. So the question is it worth reducing the training time of the quantum computer given all the other infrastructure that's available out there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a data scientist, so I need the results faster. So I definitely require the resulting time to be reduced, training time to be reduced. But my question is, like, is it really worth spending a lot of amount of money in quantum computers where the alternative of AWS services being very cheaper?
Yeah, so is it worth the alternative of the massive amounts of classical compute that's available to us versus the price of a quantum computer that can work there? So we mentioned before the benchmark that Google reached last year in its quantum computer outperforming a classical benchmark. It's a really important scientific benchmark that they reached. But we still need to reach the economic benchmark of what is the cost per solve to doing something. Is it more effective to do it on a bunch of classical computers or solve it on one quantum computer? The great news is that quantum computing is already price competitive with what's available on a classical computer, even with these early stage machines. One of the reasons for that is that quantum computers become exponentially more powerful as we add more qubits to it. So it is likely that a quantum computer will start to radically outperform the classical alternative. One of the other inputs to that is that the energy cost, so literally the amount of electricity that we feed into a data center, is much less than what goes into a classical data center, orders of magnitude less. And so just the technology is exotic, but the inputs to that are much, much lower than what is available on classical. And so for those reasons and many others, we believe that quantum computing will very soon pass that cost per solve benchmark that we're looking for that economic benefit.
Yeah, but don't you think like AWS is already cheaper now? So don't you think like by that time their services will get even more faster and cheaper than this alternative?
So quantum computing is being incorporated into AWS, so it will be a part of the AWS offering, and so you'll be able to choose from there. Ben?
So I'd be curious, whenever I feel like we talk about these new transformative technologies or theories, as culture people, we're always interested in how they're perceived. And I know we've talked about the potential and what it could actually do. I'm curious about, in your opinion, what are maybe the misconceptions about quantum computing? What is the industry not getting right about it? Because as we've talked about, it's still fairly nascent.
Yeah, one of the misperceptions about it is how this technology will come into our lives. I think we have grown up in a world where we're used to computers being delivered in a box that we either order from the internet or we pick up at the store. And so our mindset around compute is that it comes in a box and we own it and we hold it and it's in our house. But that's really changed in the last couple of years, where compute exists on the cloud and we access that through the devices that are in our hands and sit at our desk. And quantum computing is a cloud-first technology. It's really exotic. There's challenging hardware to work with. It requires a lot of tender loving care to keep operational. And so this is probably the first technology that's only going to exist in the cloud and probably won't ever exist in our homes or in our pockets. And so just how we interact with that kind of technology as it comes into our lives, I think this is the first of what will be many examples like that.
I'm curious on what the development process is like for your software layer that interfaces with your hardware, and because we're still learning more and more about quantum computing. So how do you verify those results and be this is accurate? And building upon that, you mentioned all these private companies having their intellectual property based on around quantum computing. Do you think that's going to be a barrier for the open source community when we're building applications? And do you see an over-reliance on these private institutions also at the government level when we're expanding our security systems?
Yeah, so the question was around how we build up the software layers that enable us to work with quantum computers. That's a really important part of the stack. It's a exotic new technology that's building up at the hardware level, and we need new software that helps us drive that, and particularly the way that the quantum parts of it interact with the classical side as well. The good news is that all of the developers of quantum computing hardware who are also producing their software are making that available open source, because we need to distribute this technology. We need to put it into other people's hands, and we need contributors back to that, because we won't be able to generate all of the ideas and solve all of the problems there. So whether it's with Rigetti or IBM or Microsoft or whoever, there is a vast open source community that's contributing to that world. Where the opportunity is, and I guess the innovation is right at the top, at the application level. So the way that you adapt this new type of algorithm to your specific business problem or the thing that you need solved or that pain point, that's where it's proprietary right now, and I expect that that's where it will remain proprietary in the same way that the classical computing world has unfolded. Yep. Yep.
So earlier in the round table, they were discussing people's tax returns, their medical records, their personal passwords. It almost made me think of Skynet in Terminator 2, the computers becoming self-aware. And while I think that's probably a few years off, it does beg the question of ethics. You work at a company that's birthing this type of technology. What are the ethical conversations that go on with your partners that are the first ones that are touching this technology and being able to use it? What is kind of the conversation? How does it? Are we even there yet because it's not so expansive, or is it something that maybe needs to be talked about even more?
Yeah, so the question was around the ethics of this new technology, and as something as potentially powerful as quantum computing comes into existence, how do we as a company and as a community think about this and the right way to go about it? It is a really important part of our conversation as we develop this and what we want this to be used for and the way that we go about developing it. It's also a challenging conversation because it's a technology. It doesn't feel anything itself, and like many technologies, it can be used for a multitude of purposes. GPS is the classic example of a dual-use technology that came from a military need but is now powering so much of our economy. And quantum computing will likely be part of that story as well, as a dual-use technology that's used in many different ways. But what we think is important to that is not to keep it secret, but to allow it to be a technology that's well understood, that's out there, that people can access through AWS or the open source community, and if people understand what it is and are able to work with it, that broadens the base of conversation that we're able to have and have those diverse points of view in there.
So kind of off of the conversation we had yesterday in the briefing where we talked a little bit about bias in algorithms and AI, I'm wondering if quantum computing, because of all of the patterns it's able to find, all the information it's able to take in and how fast it's able to do all of that, will it be able to cut back on some of the bias that's baked into algorithms and stuff like that?
So potentially it may be helpful in doing that. And helpful in the same way that we were talking about before with the data scientists being able to interact more often with the results. Because I think that that's where humans are able to make judgment way better than what computers will ever be able to do. We need the data scientists and software engineers and analysts working with the data in such a way that they can form those opinions and be aware of biases and those kind of societal, cultural things that it's difficult to program into a computer. So if we get more human touch on algorithms, then we'll improve the results there.
I think we have a question from Camilla with the back. And then,
I think I understood from earlier that quantum computing is evolving faster than classical computing. Does it mean that it's outpacing Moore's law in some weird, like, double exponential way?
So the question's around how quickly is quantum computing developing? Are we catching up to the developments that are happening in classical? So classical computing is continuing to accelerate. It is the dominant computing paradigm in the world and is being invested in regardless of what other technologies are coming along. And so for quantum computing to be successful, we need to catch an accelerating base of technology as well. And that convergence is starting to happen. We are starting to see quantum computing being able to perform very close to classical benchmarks. But yeah, that's the challenge that we've got, is how to catch an accelerating benchmark.
Michael, I have a final question. As you know, we at Sparks and Honey work with a range of clients around solving complex, wicked challenges, answering questions for their business using Q, our 5 layers of AI and that sort of thing. I was sort of really impressed with how accessible you explained this technology with very practical examples. I was curious, how do you go about to build the appetite in corporations to start experiments, and what could we do at Sparks and Honey to help us?
So the appetite for quantum computing and high-performance computing in general is coming from the need to extract value from data. And so in much the same way that Q works with large data sets and predicting the future, quantum computing is a new tool in that toolbox. And so people are looking to reduce their costs on compute, because that's increasing, reduce the amount of time it takes to solve these problems and get answers faster, and to get higher quality results from that work. And so we anticipate that quantum computing is going to play a major factor in that story. As data exponentially increases in its collection and usefulness, quantum computing will be one more tool in that toolbox to help unlock that value.
So if we had a client interested, you could potentially come and give them a presentation, talk through some hypothetical scenarios?
Absolutely. So working with a particular client on their domain and the challenging optimization problems, the challenging machine learning problems, and showing how quantum computing could be used with their existing classical work to create value.
So there's a learning path.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you.